Hey guys, this is Mr. Moore, and I'm here with week 13 notes. This week we're talking about political development. As we are working our way through this AP European history class, I want to remind you of the units that we've already covered. The first unit in this AP European history class is the Renaissance and Exploration. The second unit is the Age of Reformation. The third unit is constitutionalism and absolutism. And the fourth unit covers really a couple of different topics: the scientific revolution, the age of enlightenment, which is philosophical developments, and political developments. And during this age of enlightenment, there was a lot of clashes within different ideologies. And some of these clashes of ideologies actually transpose themselves into actual military conflicts, like the American Revolution and like the French Revolution. This week, I'm going to do a brief review of the American Revolution, and then next week, we're going to talk about the French Revolution. And so, as we're talking about this, I really want to spend a lot of time helping you understand how politics work in the modern world, not just how it worked back in the past during the history. Sometimes people in a history class, they start thinking to themselves, man, why do I care about what happened 300 years ago? I care about what's going on right now. In fact, while we're doing this lecture, it's being recorded, we're having an American presidential election. So people are getting involved in their government, and people get really passionate and sometimes even angry about politics. Wars are fought over politics. In some ways, we might see World War II as the greatest war in human history was fought between liberals and conservatives. So it's not just something that's happening in current presidential discussions or debates or contests or elections. Wars have been fought over politics. And so we need to see how politics have developed over time. It's been said that you should never talk politics with friends, or they won't be your friends. Or you should never talk politics at the dinner table, or you'll have a family argument. Politics and religion, right? Those are the two things that people say you should keep out of conversation. But the truth is, that's really what we talk about in this class. We spent time talking about religious conflict and religious wars in the Reformation. And now we're talking about political division and divisiveness. And what I really want you to understand is modern day politics. And I hope during this lecture, what I'm going to do is just kind of reach back into history and help you guys to see it, how it affects you today. I always have an essential question because I want us to stay focused on where we're heading with this discussion. And I want you to see how you see the world. I want you to understand how you see the world. Is it through liberal eyes or conservative eyes? And if you have no idea what that means, hang on to your pants, because by the end of this lecture, I hope you're going to be able to plop yourself on the political spectrum. And when people talk about the left or the right on a political spectrum, you'll understand what that means. And you'll be able to see how it developed over time. And again, this week 13 notes is political development in the Age of Enlightenment. However, I left off that subtitle, Age of Enlightenment, because I am going to teach you how it works in the real world today. Now, we need to pause for a minute, and we need to refresh our brains on what we're doing here. Most students who take AP European History at Apple Valley High School are sophomores. And the problem is that last year, during your freshman year, you didn't take a history class. So you went from no history class straight into a AP college level class. The last class you took was during the 8th grade. And if you remember, 8th graders in California study U.S. history. And we have to remember that the United States of America was born during the Enlightenment. So the ideals that we believe in as a nation, the ideals that we use to construct our country and to write our most important documents, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the ideas for those documents, the ideas that really shaped the beginning of our nation were coming out of the Enlightenment. And so really, in a lot of ways, our country is a product of the Enlightenment era. Those people who were talking in the salons in France and the coffee houses in Great Britain, those ideas that were put onto paper in the form of pamphlets because governments were censoring newspapers over in Europe. Those ideas came to the colonies, and some of the ideas were born in the colonies, but those ideas went back and forth across the Atlantic through trade and the process and movement of people, and thus our country was born. I always like to point out that our country is not that old. Our country was born in 1776. Now, I was born in 1976. I'm a bicentennial baby, meaning that I was born during the 200th year of our country existing. And 200 years might seem like a long time, but I have a grandma who passed away. She grew up in North Carolina. She used to have this really thick Southern accent. I could hardly understand a word she was saying, but I love my grandma. My daddy was born in North Carolina, grew up in the South. And when I talked to my grandma, she was almost 100 when she passed away. Not quite. But when I think about my grandma almost reaching 100, and then I think about how old our country is, I think, man, our country is really just two grandmas old and me. Two really, really old grandmas and Mr. Moore. That's how long our country's been around. So just for a few minutes, I'm going to refresh your brain on some things you've already learned. And I want to remind you that American history, the history of the United States, is European history until 1776, when we divorce ourselves from the British Empire with the Declaration of Independence. So, just a reminder of some of the famous battles during the American Revolution. Everybody's heard of Lexington and Concord. Those are the first battles where the shot that was heard around the world, where colonists, Minutemen, and the British troops, the Redcoats, faced off for the first time. And this was in 1775, before the Declaration of Independence was signed. We were having armed conflict with the British because we didn't want to pay taxes if we didn't have a say in government. And that's one of the key things that we're talking about right here with this political development. If you have a king who's running your country and he tells you what to do, you either obey the king or you get your head chopped off or you're hung in a tree as a traitor, literally. The king doesn't care what you think, right? Or if you live in an empire. So there's no need for politics if you have a king. You either obey or you're dead or thrown in jail, right? Or kicked out of the country, or you have to flee for your life. But the point is, politics don't matter. But when we start to create countries where people run and govern themselves, then politics start to become a thing. Battle of Bunker Hill, of course. You've probably heard that expression, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. I hope you learned this stuff back in 8th grade. That was armed conflict right before the Declaration of Independence. The Battle of Trenton, on Christmas Day, where George Washington, they crossed the Delaware and they surprise the British. Actually, it wasn't the British. It was Prussian troops that the British hired. So actually, George Washington was fighting German troops in the colonies that were hired by the British as mercenaries. That's fascinating, right? Hessian troops. So really interesting stuff that was going on in Saratoga. Finally, the colonists proved that they could stand up against the British, and the French decided to step in and militarily and financially support the colonists. And so it was really French support. The key to Saratoga was French support. The French decided to help us, fund us, because they wanted payback from the 7 Years' War. And of course, Yorktown is the last battle of the American Revolution, when the French helped blockade the British in with their navy, and armed troops, French and colonial troops, surround the British at Yorktown and they surrender, right? So those are just some of the more famous battles. I know you learned about this a couple of years back. I just want to refresh your brain. Remember that at this point in British history, the British have what we start to call a constitutional monarchy. So if you remember back to the Glorious Revolution in 1688, almost 100 years before the American Revolution, William and Mary are invited. William of Orange and Mary from the Stuart family are invited to become monarchs of Great Britain, and they are subject to the laws of Parliament, meaning that they're not absolute monarchs, but they're constitutional monarchs. And the word constitution refers to a limitation on the powers of the king or queen. And William and Mary don't have kids, so Queen Anne steps in for a while. After they're both dead, William and Mary, Queen Anne rules, and she has tons of kids, but none of them survive. I mean, don't quote me on the number, but something like 17 pregnancies, and none of her kids live to adulthood. So they give it to another relative, the closest one to Queen Anne. And that's when we get into George the First, George the Second, and then George the Third. And it's George the Third who's the King of England. He's a constitutional monarch, and the colonists don't like the taxation and the fact that when they have problems, the king won't listen to their problems. And so they write the Declaration of Independence. So George the Third is who the Americans are breaking away from, or politically divorcing, if you will. General Cornwallis is the top British commander. And of course, Benedict Arnold is the most famous American who switches sides and joins the British team. Benedict Arnold was one of the key, he was a really important commander in George Washington's army. But I guess in a way, George Washington's a traitor too, because he was a British general during the 7 Years' War, and then he fought against the British. So it's really a matter of perspective, maybe even a matter of dates, if you're a hero or a traitor, right? Remember that these are Enlightenment ideas that the American Revolution is born out of. Before I get going too far, I just want to remind you that this was a flag. This snake you see, this rattlesnake coiled up and ready to strike, was one of the flags that patriots used to carry around during the American Revolution, right? Don't mess with us. Don't mess with our rights. We're a snake ready to strike. I kind of like that. I know we ended up with the stars and the stripes, but that flag was pretty cool. And at some point was kind of considered to be our American flag when we were colonials fighting the British. But here's some of the Enlightenment ideas that I'm talking about. No taxation without representation, right? Remember last week I talked about that pizza theory of taxes and how most people are okay paying taxes as long as they have a say in their government. But if they have to pay taxes and they don't have a say in their government, well, that's frustrating. And that's what gets people angry and upset. People are still angry and upset about taxes. It's one of the things that kind of drives us together as Americans, if you will. Give me liberty or give me death, right? That's a very Enlightenment idea, and that's a famous battle cry of the American Revolution. Live free or die, right? We're taking the ideas of the Enlightenment and we're putting blood to them. We're saying these aren't just ideas, and we're going to take action on it, right? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Remember that John Locke, the British philosopher who wrote during the Glorious Revolution of 1688, kind of coined the phrase about natural rights that everybody have, that you don't have to earn, that just because you're a human, you have them. He said life, liberty, and the rights to property. And of course, Thomas Jefferson kind of poeticized him, I guess you will, but totally borrowed John Locke, the Enlightenment philosopher's ideas, when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So Thomas Jefferson, who becomes our third president, the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence, he's an Enlightenment thinker. He's an Enlightenment writer. Okay? Remember, these people took these Enlightenment ideals and they said that they wanted to participate in government. And so they acted on it, right? They felt like they were being pushed around by the British government, so they protested in Boston. And some soldiers, British soldiers, redcoats, fired into a crowd of unarmed people, right? And we got the Bloody Massacre, or sometimes called the Boston Massacre. Shortly thereafter, we have the Boston Tea Party, right? Where people are protesting this hike in taxes. Because remember, the British government was trying to cover probably the most expensive war they ever fought in up to that point, the 7 Years' War, sometimes called the French and Indian War. And so American colonists, well, they are British subjects, but American colonists go and dress up like Indians and dump tea into the harbor, right? The Boston Tea Party. And then, of course, British troops start to actively pursue colonists and colonial Minutemen, these patriots. And so we get like the midnight ride of Paul Revere, where he's warning, from town to town. And of course, we've romanticized these things. And then we get Valley Forge, where George Washington has taken command of the colonial army, and the Continental Congress has given him charge. And, they barely survived the winter, right, out there freezing to death at Valley Forge. But George Washington somehow keeps the army together, and they live to fight another day. And finally, the American Revolution is finished after the Battle of Yorktown. A treaty is signed in Paris. That's where the treaty was signed. We didn't sign a treaty in the colonies. We signed a treaty in Europe to end the American Revolution, called the Treaty of Paris. And so I think that's interesting. Our American history is European history. Until 1776, we start to divorce ourselves. It's a slow divorce. And, there's complications. Who's going to keep what kids? And by that, I mean territories. And okay, we fight again even after we're divorced with the British. We fight again in the War of 1812, when the British come in and burn down I'm air quoting, White House. They burned down Washington, D.C., a brand new, city that was being built to be our nation's capital. Yes, Washington, D.C. has been attacked and burnt to the ground by the British in a second war. That's the next war America fights after the American Revolution. So it's a slow and painful separation process, and we end up getting involved in European affairs when we fight in World War I and World War II. We literally send troops over to Europe to fight. That's up and coming in other lectures. But I think it's important to remember some of the groups that really rallied around these ideas of freedom and equality. And those are the Sons of Liberty, who are causing trouble, in Boston and really pushing for independence. And the Continental Congress, kind of modeling a system like the British Parliament. Parliament was really running the country, not George III. He was the king, but remember, he's a constitutional monarch, and so Parliament does have a lot of power. And so American colonists didn't have representation in Parliament, so we kind of formed our own Continental Congress, sort of a parliament in the colonies, if you will. And Minutemen were out there to try to arm themselves, There are important documents that come out of the American Revolution, and they really explain the ideals of the Enlightenment. Right? Like Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense, how regular people should be involved. And because we're enlightened, because we've surpassed the ancients, and we've had this rebirth of the Renaissance, and we've had this sort of religious freedom because of the Reformation. And we've started to integrate science instead of superstition during the scientific revolution. By the time of the Enlightenment, people were saying that we, the people, could rule. Okay, and so Thomas Paine's pamphlet, right, an enlightened pamphlet, really stirred up people's feelings in the colonies, the American colonies. Well, they're the British colonies, but they're going to become the original United States. Remember, on our flag, we have 13 stripes for a reason. Okay, the Declaration of Independence I have discussed at length. I think it's the second most important document in our country. I think the first most important document is the Constitution, which was written just after the American Revolution. For a while, we tried to run our country on the Articles of Confederation. They're the exact opposite of a monarchy, where there really isn't any power in the government. It's not quite anarchy, but it's a confederation. It's not a union of states. The Articles of Confederation lasted for about 10 years, from, say, 1777, when the Continental Congress was, after the Declaration of Independence was signed and we're fighting the American Revolution, we lived under what was called the Articles of Confederation, but they didn't work. Again, I think you've learned this stuff. I'm just trying to refresh your brain on it. And finally, of course, it didn't work, so we had to have a constitutional convention where, our founding forefathers, John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and of course George Washington was there, and we sit down and try to pound out where to take our country and what needs to change, and we use Montesquieu's ideas, that French philosoph's ideas of separating the branches of government into three separate but equal branches, right? All happening, and of course the British, right after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, right afterwards, we're talking like 1689, right? The British are putting together a Bill of Rights that the king and parliament have to abide by, right? So that people have protection, and especially parliament. Parliament wasn't necessarily a thing of the people per se. It becomes a thing of the people. It really started out as a collection of nobles and lords, but over time, it definitely starts to get some representation of the people with the House of Commons. The House of Lords, of course, remains that nobility and kind of hearkening back to a time where nobility ruled. But the English present themselves a Bill of Rights. And because people in the colonies in the 1700s are subject of the British Crown, they like that idea of a Bill of Rights. And so the United States creates its own Bill of Rights. Really important stuff. And of course, tons of papers are written to support the Constitution. Those are the Federalist Papers. Remember that the French help the colonists win. And it's not because the French just want to be good guys. It's because the French want payback for the 7 Years' War. And they lost all their overseas territories in the Americas. They wanted to have some influence back. But the great thing about the French help is they didn't require any land. And we really didn't have to do anything except convince them that we were a worthy ally. And the French come in, and the French don't get anything out of winning the American Revolution. The French really help us win. But all they get out of it is bragging rights. And what they also get out of it is extreme debt. And it's going to lead to the French Revolution. It's going to break down one of the strongest and most prestigious monarchies, dynasties, whatever you want to say. It's going to break down one of the most important countries in Europe, France. And the French Revolution is huge. Next week, we're talking about the French Revolution. But some of the famous French guys that helped out in the American Revolution is Lafayette, America's favorite fighting Frenchman. And of course, Rochambeau is a Navy captain who helps, as we blockade the British in and win. And of course, some of our founding forefathers, George Washington, John Adams, who becomes our second president, Thomas Jefferson, our third president, James Madison, who pretty much wrote the Constitution, as our fourth president. Alexander Hamilton never becomes president because he's shot in a duel with the vice president. Yeah, that's a good story. Check out the musical on Disney Plus or something, right? Benjamin Franklin never becomes president. He was super old by the time the American Revolution happened, and he, kind of helped negotiate things in France to get French aid. But by the time we won the American Revolution, he's getting out of politics and getting ready to pass on to the next adventure after life. And Samuel Adams, cousin of John Adams, he's a rebel rouser, Sons of Liberty. So again, I don't mean to spend the entire time on the American Revolution, but I do want to hearken back to things you've already learned. And if you didn't learn this in the 8th grade, you missed out. It's good stuff. And next year, everybody has to take a U.S. history class. So I'm not going to spend any more time dwelling on this particular stuff. But I do need you to see the integration of American history and, of course, European history, because American history is European history until 1776. Now, all of that is going to kind of lead us into the political spectrum. Now, this is the modern political spectrum, and in a minute, I'm going to go back and show you how this came to be. But on your notes, I need you to draw a line. I need you to take some time. If you're doing this digitally, you can insert a drawing Okay, or you can snapshot something and throw it in there. But I need you to, if you're doing it on paper, it's great because you can draw out this political spectrum. When people talk about politics, they talk about the left and the right. And so I need you to label the left side of your arrow and the right side of your arrow, this arrow representing the political spectrum. I need you to leave room on the top and the bottom because it's going to help us as we dialogue politics and how politics work. There is a centric line. Later on, I'm going to talk about this line kind of shifts left and right depending on who the current leaders are and current problems and trends are. It does shift over time, and it is in a different place depending on which country you live in. That's kind of a complicated way to start, but there's a centric line. Please make there a centric line. And of course, you have the left labeled and the right labeled. On the left side, I need you to label liberals. The left side is liberals. Now, you don't know what that word means yet. Maybe you do, but I haven't talked about what it means yet. I'm going to, okay? But we're going to label the left liberals. Easy to remember, left liberals. On the right side of the political spectrum, we're going to put the word conservatives. And again, you might not know what the word conservative means. If something is conservative, if a person is conservative, if an idea is conservative, what does that mean? I'm going to talk about it in a second, but I need you to put it on the right side of the political spectrum. Now, every country has people who are on the left and people who are on the right. Okay? And neither side is correct. It's just how you conceive, how you see things, how you conceive of a solution to problems. People in our country who are on the left and the right both love our country. They just see different ways of fixing the problem. Okay, in our country, the most dominant political party on the left is the Democrats. Okay, so I need you to make an association between left, liberal, and Democrats. Okay, the mascot for the Democratic Party in the United States is the jackass. Kind of a funny story if you're familiar with the 7th president of the United States, Andrew Jackson. He is on the $20 bill, so I suspect you should know who Andrew Jackson is. He was a very liberal at the time, Democrat kind of idea, man of the people kind of a thing, all about progress and moving forward. And somebody called him a jackass one time, and he thought that was so funny that he kind of adopted that as the mascot of the Democrat Party. Andrew Jackson was a really significant president, and he was a rough and tough dude. Got shot in the chest in a duel and had a bullet lodged in him that surgeons during the time couldn't remove. So it was still in him when he was president. He got in a lot of fights, and he really significant. But again, I'm not going into U.S. history right now. We're sticking with European history. On the right side, on the conservative side, the political party that's associated with that in the United States is the Republicans. So think Republicans right, liberals left, and you'll get lots of answers right on the test. And also it will make more sense as we dialogue and discuss that. And of course, the GOP, the Grand Old Party, uses the elephant as their mascot. No really funny story like the jackass. But anyways, the donkey and the elephant, those are the mascots of the political parties in the United States, Democrats and Republicans. And I need you to understand left, liberal, right, conservative, and where the two main political parties in the United States fall. Okay? What does it mean to be a liberal? What does it mean to be a Democrat? Like, what kind of ideals do you believe in? We could talk for hours and hours about what it means to be a Democrat or a Republican. I'm going to try to simplify it in our notes today. In general, Democrats like big government, and they're okay paying more taxes because they expect more services. So if you got a liberal brain, you're probably thinking, I think the government should do more. I think the government should be more involved. I think the government should fix these problems. And I'm okay paying higher taxes because I know those taxes are going to roads and schools and police forces and fire departments and paying for, all that kind of stuff. Okay, on the opposite side of the political spectrum, Republicans in general, and again, this is modern political spectrum. These things do shift over time, but modern Republicans in the United States, these conservative thinkers, want a small government. They want the government to have the least amount of impact in my life. I don't want the government getting in my face. I'm a smart person. I can handle myself. I don't need the government telling me what to do. And I don't want the government taking my hard-earned money. If I work hard and I have extra money, I'll give that to the poor and stuff like that. But I don't want the government taking my money. They're just going to mismanage it. And I don't want the government to fix problems. The government screws up stuff. It doesn't fix problems. Those are kind of more conservative thinking. Now, I'm going to try to do my best to not sway you to either direction. In fact, my objective here today is to get you to put yourself on the political spectrum where you see yourself. Okay, that's the number one objective right here. I am going to teach history as well. This is a history class, but I'm also going to try to help you understand modern politics. And then, like I said, I'm going to go back and show you how it came to be. Okay, now, if you're on the left, you're kind of frustrated with the status quo. You're kind of frustrated with the way it's always been, that there's been rich people and poor people, and the rich people abuse the poor people. And so you want equality in society. And you think the system is broke or the system's not fair. And you want there to be equality in society. That's a liberal left idea. On the conservative side of the political spectrum, generally the conservative side is okay with rich and poor. They're okay with rich and poor because the rich deserve to be rich and the poor deserve to be poor. The rich work super hard and they're smart and they take risks. Especially in the United States, people believe that if you work hard and you're smart and you've got a great idea, anybody can be rich. Like, that's the American dream, right? And people get what they deserve. Those poor people who are dropping out of high school and not even graduating, they don't deserve as big of a slice of the pie as the person who went to 8 years of college to get a doctorate and to become a physician. Right? The people who have money are the ones who are smarter and work harder, and the poor people deserve it because they're kind of slacking off. And sometimes, people need to catch a break. So it's not like people on the conservative side are heartless. I don't want to say that at all, but they don't think the government should fix it. Some of them who are super rich become philanthropists where they give money back and they set up funds to help poor people go to college, but they say you got to work for it, right? Those kind of ideals. So those are kind of some of the differences right there. Progressive values. If you are on the left, you like to look forward. You might say things like get with the times. Progressive values, like for instance, you might say, hey, it's 2020. If two dudes love each other and want to get married, let them get married. Why does that even bother you? On the opposite side, on the right side, it's more traditional values where we're kind of looking backwards and kind of saying, hey, something like marriage, like, dude, marriage has always been between a man and a woman. That's literally what marriage means. So, we shouldn't be changing those things just because, we want to get with the times. Let's look back at the past and look back at how great things were. So you really kind of get people looking in opposite directions with the left and the right. The left is always looking forward, progress, get with the times, move forward. And the right has a tendency to look to the past and look to traditions, okay? So those are just simple ways to kind of put yourself on this political spectrum and start to understand what it means to be liberal and conservative. Now, there are, of course, people who fall in the middle who are moderate, or independence is a word. And I think the closer you stay to the middle, the safer you are. And politicians understand this too. Many modern politicians try to stay as close to the center as they can to get the most votes. Because if you're a Democrat and you're hanging out close to the center, then you can say to the people right here, hey guys, I'm just like you. I mean, I have a little bit more progressive values, but I still love American. I love, And a Republican who's over here, he might say, I believe that there's rich and poor, but I also don't, I think we want to help out the poor, and we want to, do make things more equal access to things. So the closer you hang to the center, the safer you are. The problem is when people get to, and here's a fancy word, radical, or if they're extremists. If you're a radical or extremist, it means you're super far left or super far to the right. Okay? You can have radicals or extremists on either side. Okay? So what does it look like if you get too far to the left? We have a label that we put down: communism. Now, the idea of communism is not really going to take shape until the middle of the 1800s, like 1848. Karl Marx is going to write his Communist Manifesto with Frederick Engels, and I mean, it's going to really shatter politics in Europe in the 1800s. But radicals on the left, it's not safe. It's not good. Okay, communism, it was a bad word in the United States after World War II. During the Cold War, we almost had World War III. It was like democracy versus communism. And communism is having everything equal. And the guy who cleans the toilets and the guy who, does heart surgery gets the same amount of the slice of the pie in society, because both are fulfilling a cog in the gear. It's supposed to be a worker's paradise, and there's no rich and no poor. But we're going to have to talk about some of the problems of communism. On the far right, we get fascism. And fascism can be extremely racist and extremely nationalistic, thinking that your people, your country is the greatest. It's that whole idea of look at the past and see how great our country is, and everybody else is scum of the earth. The most famous fascist leader was Adolf Hitler. Hitler is a fascist. The Nazis were fascists. So if you go too far to the right, you end up being a Nazi. Or if I want to use an American term, I might say KKK, right? The Ku Klux Klan. That would be an extreme right fascist group. Now, if you're thinking, whoa, if I go too far to the right, I'm dangerous, that's bad. But communism, that sounds better. Well, I'll tell you, probably one of the most evil villains on the planet Earth that ever lived was Joseph Stalin. Killed more people than Hitler did. So if you go too far to the left or too far to the right, you get into these nut jobs. You get into this crazy time. So going too far from the center either direction is not good. If you look at a list of the worst people in the history of the world, it's not Hitler. I'm not trying to defend Hitler. Hitler's number 3. Hitler was horrible. Hitler's a jerk. Fascism and racism has no place in the world. But Mao Zedong, the communist leader of China, and Joseph Stalin, the dictator, the totalitarian leader of the Soviet Union, wow, you should see how many people they killed in their country. And of course, you get people like Mussolini and Hitler, who are horrific, dangerous people, and really started World War II, the biggest war in human history. So my point is not to sway you to the left or the right, but really the more moderate you stay, the safer you are. Now, I did tell you that this line changes over time. In fact, if you just look at U.S. politics, our current president is more towards the Republican side, right? He is a Republican, or he says he's a Republican. He says he's conservative, okay? But our last president before that, Barack Obama, was a Democrat. And before that, you got like George W. Bush, right? And before that, you got Bill Clinton. You can see the pattern, right? It swings back and forth. Everybody hates the current president. So this line does shift slightly, over time. Just because of the way it works, I think it's always slightly shifting to the left, because the left is progress, right? Progress and kind of leaving tradition back in the past. Although people do try to pull us back with a modern twist to it, if you will. But if you just look at like TV shows and people's values in general, they're definitely getting more progressive. That's not, something that could be debated. If you look at like Leave It to Beaver TV show made back, 50s or whatever, or Andy Griffith's show, and you look at like the kind of TV shows they have today, we have to put ratings on them because there's so much in them. Progressive value, it's always leaning that direction, I think, in general, unless something pushes it the other direction. Now, it's also this line, this centric line, can shift by depending on which country you live in. For instance, the United States is a center line. We are significantly more conservative than European countries. The center line in most European countries would be quite further left than our line. So, in other words, even if you're a conservative in a European country, we as Americans might think you're kind of liberal, if that makes sense. Okay. So I think that's kind of important to understand that the center line is not the same in every country, although every country that is governing, the people are governing themselves and using, voting and elections and campaigning and that kind of process. In other words, if there's democracy, then they have these kind of political ideologies. Okay. Center. Some of the things that I like to think about, because sometimes people are still like, still not understanding this, Mr. Moore. Sometimes I think of high school grades to explain political ideology theory, because some people just don't understand. They like, I love having equality in society and everything being the same. And some people are saying, well, rich and poor, it's not the same. Let me just try to use high school grades for a second to kind of paint a picture. For instance, I have in my AP class this year, I have about 4 people who are failing right now as I'm recording this. That means they have an F. They will not get high school graduation credit. I also have like 6 or 7 people who have more than 100% in class. Now, if you want to get an A, if you want to get an A plus in my class, you have to get a 97%. Everything above a 97% doesn't do you any good. You can't get an A plus plus plus. So the idea, the political theory here is then, what if you were to take some of the points from those people that have more than an A plus and gift it? Okay, it's the teacher. I take that and give that to the kids that are failing so that no kid fails. And so people start asking themselves, they say, well, that's not fair. That's not fair because the people who are failing, they're getting lazy on their homework and they're not studying for their tests and they're not doing extra credit. I'm busting my butt to get an A plus. There's no way I want to give those points to the kid who's failing. That's a very conservative mental ideology, what I just explained right there. Now, what's a liberal ideology with grades? Some of those kids might say, well, I'm failing Mr. So-and-so's class. Let's just say Mr. Sun Devil's class. I'm failing his class, but he's not fair. He doesn't teach us. He doesn't control the class. He doesn't lecture to us, teach us. And I'm failing his class, but it's not my fault. The teacher's not being fair. The system's not fair. And that might be true. An A in Mr. Moore's class and an A in Mr. Sun Devil's class is not the same thing. Maybe the system is broken. Maybe there does need to be some oversight and some regulation to say what makes an A, what makes a B, what makes a C. I mean, if we have, if the system's broken, then we need to equalize things. It's not fair if a kid fails in a class where the teacher's not doing their job. So there are both left and right ideologies that could be applied to the high school grades theory, if you will. So where do you see yourself? I think it's important in your notes to kind of, even if you don't write it on your notes, to kind of place yourself. Are you more moderate or independent, or do you sway to the right or to the left? I'm not here to sway you either direction. I'm just here to teach you. Now, it turns out the real world is way more complex. And if you want to spend some time and kind of get into politics, this is a great chart to look at, where it kind of gives you some of the different ideals and beliefs and how things look. I think that each side wants to fix problems, but they see different solutions. My concern is that I don't like political parties. I don't like the Democrats or Republicans. I'll repeat that again. I don't like the Republicans or the Democrats, because political parties tend to look out for their own self-interest and not for the good of the country. So if you ask me if I'm left or right, I don't like either one, to be honest. If you're offered 2 choices and both of those choices suck, well, it doesn't feel like you really have a choice, does it? If somebody offers you, oh, you're hungry? Oh, here's some poop or some vomit. Which one do you want? I say, I'm not hungry. I don't like this, and I don't feel like it's really representative of the ideals that our country was founded on. But that's just a little side note right there. So don't think I'm trying to sway you left or right here. No way. I really do feel like you should stay as close to the center as possible and not get into those radical extremes. Just a couple of other quick things, though. The left in modern days seems to be more environmentally conscientious. They would kind of say the system's not fair, and that's why we need to equalize things more. And if you grow up in an urban area, like in a city with lots of diversity, you're probably swayed more to the left. Um, the right is more business oriented. It's not that they don't like the environment, but they feel like it's a tool, to make money and to get better. So in a way, there is also progress on the right. I don't want you to think that they're always just. It's not like they want to ignore technology and go back to the Stone Age. No, I'm just talking about values, not industry. They're very business oriented. Work hard to make your own way kind of a mentality. And if you're more from a rural place that is like countryside, then that's more. You're probably swayed more to the right. Like if you grow up in New York City, you probably lean more to the left side. If you grow up in Wyoming on a ranch, you're probably more to the right side. In the United States, we kind of color it blue and red to kind of distinguish the two sides. Where does our current president? Well, while I'm recording this, Donald Trump is the president, and he's on the right side. He's running against Joe Biden, who's on the left side. And as I've talked about, it sways back and forth. It seems like everybody hates the current president, right? They're always looking for change, and it seems like it's been that way for forever. Where does California sit? If you don't know, California in general tends to be more on the left side. However, Apple Valley, because it's more a rural part of California, is more on the right side. So if you don't know this, you kind of live in a conservative pocket of a liberal state, if that kind of makes sense, okay? That doesn't mean everybody in Apple Valley loves Donald Trump, or doesn't mean that everybody down in San Francisco or up in San Francisco is going to vote for Joe Biden, because there's going to be people all over who have different feelings, but those are just some general trends that might be helpful for you. Now, I kind of like to point out that there are different ways of looking at government. You don't just have to look at it as a left and right, but that's how people talk about it in the news, on the radio, on the internet. They talk about left and right wing politics, but there's a different way to look at it. If we were just to have a scale of no government, zero government, or complete and absolute government controlling everything. See the scale right here, 100% the government has total power over everything versus no government at all. This is a different way of looking at it, the amount of government control. Okay, and the natural flow is always the government trying to collect more power. And so people have to kind of keep the government in check. That is the difference between absolutism and constitutionalism, right? So there's lots of different versions. Here's one point that I just might want to make real quick. When people look at people like Hitler, who's a fascist, and Stalin, who's a communist, these are the two guys who really duked it out in World War II. Okay, fascism, Nazis, Hitler, versus communist, Joseph Stalin. Okay, people say, what's the difference? They're both tyrants. They're both complete jerks. They slaughtered millions of innocent people. Is there really a difference? And so this scale kind of says no. Whether you're a communist or a fascist, if you're a dictator, if you're a totalitarian leader, if you're a despot, or if you call yourself a king or an emperor, it doesn't matter. You have complete control over society. It doesn't matter politics. On the other end, there was people who were like anarchists, and I put some notes at the bottom, like in the end of the Enlightenment era. Well, in the end of the 1700s, anyways, Godwin is going to write a political justice and advocating anarchy, that there shouldn't be government. Right? Anarchists believe that there shouldn't be any government, but that's complete chaos and nothing functions and works. Even though government sucks, most of us still like there to be a little bit of somebody in control. But there is some arguments against having government. If you have a little bit of government control, we call that a republic. Okay, that's how our country started out, but we're kind of shifting more towards democracy, aka rule of the people. But maybe we're not. Maybe big corporations are paying off political campaigns, and maybe it's really these big corporations that have more power than the president. There's definitely been times in our country where that's happened. An oligarchy is where a few rule. There are massive, huge powerhouse corporations that control the money and create monopolies where they monopolize the industry. And so maybe that's where we're heading is, if you want to become president, don't you have to fundraise a ton and you get lots of money, or you have to be born rich, right? Or be a billionaire already, right? So they're kind of, both presidential candidates right now, Trump, who's a billionaire businessman, and Biden, who's also rich and has lots of rich friends and getting corporate backing, they both come from big money. Don't let them tell you anything different, right? There's a lot of money involved, and who's really pushing that around. So it depends. Are we really voting, or are we run by an oligarchy? So it's interesting. It's a different way of looking at the things. And here's the thing. I think as long as people are fat and happy, and as long as people have food on their table and are entertained, there will be no revolution. Just look at the Romans. The Romans understood. They had the gladiator fights in the circus, and they gave away free food. And they resisted people overthrowing the government. As long as we have Netflix and YouTube around, people aren't going to get riled enough to have revolution. Unless the economy completely shuts down, people don't have food on their table, then we could maybe have revolution again. Now, how did all this get started? Again, I'm going to repeat. If you have a king or a queen who's an absolute monarch and running the show, then there's no need for politics, because the king says this and you do it or you die. But what's going to happen, we just talked about the American Revolution. So the people are taking the government into their own hands. And we're going to talk about the French Revolution, where people are going to take the government into their own hands. And that's where politics start to matter. So if you want to understand why we talk about the political spectrum with the left and the right, is because during the French Revolution, those who were conservative-minded, who kind of liked to keep the status quo, they wanted to keep a king, but maybe just change the king to a constitutional monarchy, they sat on the right side of the room. And those who wanted to chop the king's head off, and they wanted to change France from the French kingdom to the Republic of France, those were the ones on the left who wanted to move forward, who were maybe a little bit more on the liberal side of things. There were some that were in the middle, some who were maybe a little bit more moderate, like the Girondins during the French Revolution. They were like, hey, we think the king's been a jerk and we want to change things, but we don't necessarily want to get our hands all bloody and sticky by chopping his head off. So let's just kind of pull some of his power away politically. But the Jacobins, those are the ones who are the radicals who end up cutting off the king's head. Sorry, that's a spoiler for next week. But in the French Revolution, the king and the queen are going to get their heads chopped off in France during the French Revolution. Okay? And so, remember that even back in these times, the left meant move towards a republican form of government, having a republic. And the right was keep the status quo. And that's one thing that's been pretty general in politics since its very conception. The right likes to keep things how it is or how it was, and the left likes to make change, move forward, and shake things up. Okay, give more power to the people, kind of a thing. Now, again, these are just general statements. I'm happy to discuss or answer questions in class, and that's why this is better to talk about this in class instead of pre-recording it, because it gives us a lot of time to discuss political developments in the French Revolution. Now, next week I'm going to talk all about the French Revolution, and I hope it's going to make more sense. George Washington, probably the greatest president ever, in my opinion. And what was so great about George Washington is he didn't let the power go to his head. I think the single most significant thing that George Washington did is after he served 2 terms as president, he stepped down and he said, I'm not going to run anymore. And people were ready to make him president for life. And he says, basically, I'm kind of summarizing his words, but he says, if I'm president for life, that's the same thing as a king. We just fought this American Revolution to get rid of the king. And now you want to put me as the king? That's the wrong solution to the problem. And They wanted to address him like Your Majesty, and he said, no, 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 just call me Mr. President. I'm a regular dude who's now, running the country, but I'm not always going to run the country. And I think that's the greatest thing that he did, is he stepped down from power. And there's not very many people that have ever done that. We have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost any person. As soon as they gain any bit of authority or power, they immediately begin to exercise and abuse that power to its fullest extent. And that's a problem. When George Washington was leaving office, he said, I don't think that we should allow factions to gain popularity in the United States. And when he said factions, he means political parties. That's what we call them today, Democrats and Republicans, political parties. He said, don't let factions become a thing. They'll only look out for their own self-interest, not for the good of the country. Whew. He also, this is interesting, George Washington in his farewell address said, if we don't resolve the problems between the North and the South, we're going to have war. And we did, right? The Civil War, the American Civil War. And he also said we should not get involved in European alliances. The Europeans are just looking out for their own balance of power, if you will. And if we join one side, we're going to end up causing problems for our own nation. So George Washington had some great advice. He only served 2 terms. And every president after him only served 2 terms until FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during the Great Depression and World War II. He got elected 4 times, and during his 4th term died in office. And after that, we added an amendment to the Constitution so nobody else could do that. Only one president broke the rules. But political parties only look out for their own good, not for the good of the whole nation. And he said, don't pick side in European conflicts. One of the real problems with a republic, we live in a republic. Remember, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic, right? One of the real problems with a republic and democracy or any voter-driven system is that people are not willing to sacrifice today for the long-term benefits, right? They're looking out for what's going to benefit their lives. And we gotta have a little bit more forethought. People are self-interested, unfortunately. They want to put, or they need to put, food on their table today. They want to pay less, even if that means hurting the environment. They want a job, even today, if that means making stuff that they really don't need, right? So one of the problems in our modern world is like reckless consumerism. Look at the trash heaps and the plastic in the ocean, right? Those kind of problems. It could drive an unsustainable economy to ruin, where we keep making stuff we don't need and we're burning through resources to get rich fast. And so we got to remember the long term. And I think that's what George Washington was saying. If we allow political parties to persuade us and corporations that are trying to make money to persuade our political opinions, and we're not looking out for really what's going to make us happy in the long term, that's significant. Keep in mind that when George Washington was president, he formed a cabinet. Those are people to advise him and to take care of the different obligations that the president had. And so our first president kind of formed a cabinet with 3, some people say 4. 3 guys were really significant. He called the Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. This is before Thomas Jefferson was president, because George Washington was the first, of course. And then he called Alexander Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury. And then he called a guy named Knox. And Knox, like Fort Knox, if you've ever heard of that right there, he called him as a Secretary of War. But today we call it a Secretary of Defense, because that sounds a lot nicer than Secretary of War. And Hamilton and Jefferson just did not see things the same way. And they both argued and fought back and forth and bickered. And they were both working for Washington. Jefferson becomes 3rd president. Hamilton's face is on the $10 bill, and I think probably would have become president, except he was shot in a duel with the vice president at the time. And they saw the world differently. And so as they discussed and debated and argued back and forth, this is really what kind of constructed the first 2 political parties in the United States. And after, those who kind of followed Jefferson's ideas, and those who followed Hamilton's ideas, we kind of saw a division within our country. Hamilton called his followers Federalist, as in support of the federal government. Okay. And those who kind of followed Jefferson's ideals at first were kind of just called anti-federalist, but he kind of labeled himself as a democratic Republican. And if you think about those two key words, they're both beautiful words, democracy and the republic. They're both things that all Americans believe in. So that's why our main political parties today take those words and use them, because they try to buy in, get Americans to buy into their ideology. Now, in a European history class, we probably need to look at the development of political parties in Great Britain. Remember, after 1688, the Glorious Revolution, where we really get a constitutional monarchy with William, right? William of Orange becomes William III, as this harkens back to several weeks ago in our notes when we talked about absolute monarchies and the transition to constitutionalism. But when we really started to get in like George the First and George the Second and George the Third, some of those kings of Great Britain actually were more German than British. So that's a long story right there. But they called a minister to run their affairs, and that job kind of became the idea of a prime minister, like Robert Walpole. He was a member of parliament, an MP, member of parliament, and he becomes the first PM, prime minister. And in the British system, they don't call them Democrats and Republicans. They called them the Whigs and the Tories, right? And the Tories were the Conservative Party, okay, believed in a strong hereditary succession, right? Wanted a strong monarchy. And the Whigs opposed a strong monarchy and wanted a stronger parliament. And so you can see this liberal and conservative divide happening in the British government. Okay, in the United States, we kind of get Democrats and Republicans over time. In the British system, it was kind of like the Whigs and the Tories. Okay, and again, we kind of talked about this political evolution in France. Now, where do you get your news from? What's the real story? What's really happening? Mr. Moore, I heard this in the news. Does that mean it's real? Is there fake news? With all the social media and the things going on out there, a lot of us ask questions. Am I really getting the truth, or am I getting a filtered version? Am I getting the facts or a filtered version of the truth? How do I know who to trust? There are some charts out there that can be really helpful like this, where they kind of show you that on a scale, on a liberal and conservative scale, down here at the bottom, you can see that some news corporations really do lean to the left, and some news really does lean to the right. And this, you might want to just take some time if you want to understand what you're getting out there. If you go too far to the left or right, I think you get into fake or so filtered that a normal person wouldn't understand it. Remember, if you get too far to the right, you end up in that fascist ideology. If you go too far to the left, you end up in that communistic, and both of them are not good. I think if you kind of stick to the center, then you'll find yourself okay. So that's kind of that ideology. Although political parties differ from country to country, and the ideas change over time, there are general trends. So if somebody's a socialist, they're on the left. If somebody is, that conservative on the right, and this again kind of shows you some of the different ideologies. And I think it's worth your time to kind of pause and look at what it means to be right wing or left wing, or to kind of be centric in your thinking. There's an age-old idea that if two people fight over little thing, then maybe everyone else won't notice what's really going on. And I think sometimes that's what happens in our politics. You get the left and the right fighting so much that you don't get the clear picture, or there's something else going on behind the scenes. Civilization is a fragile thing. And I think that civilization, this is one of my favorite quotes of all time, civilization is only 3 missed meals from anarchy. As long as people are entertained and they're fat and happy, then things will continue to move forward as they do. But when the system breaks down, chaos could ensue. And we've seen some in the news. But most of us that are alive today haven't lived through real traumatic events. And I kind of want to set the stage, because next week we're going to talk about the French Revolution. And I think it's essential that you understand how civilization, the most civilized place in Europe, France, is going to break down into a bloodbath. And thousands and thousands of people are going to be slaughtered during the French Revolution. So, what are some of the current politics that are going on in Europe? What are some of the news stories? That's why I assign current events every week so that we're paying attention to geopolitics and understanding the geography of Europe is going to help us to understand this class. And remember that over the last 500 years, Europeans had taken over almost the entire planet Earth. Now, after World War II, most European countries are going to lose their territories, but I think that's really, really significant. To kind of finish this off, I just want you to be aware of some key ideals because I kind of talk about these as if everybody knows it. It's something you should have learned, like I said, back in 8th grade. What is a democracy? When people have a say in their government. Voting is kind of the simplistic term. But of course, voting doesn't mean that people really have a say. What if the voting is rigged? What if there's other people kind of swaying an election? What if people are forced to vote? What if there's cheating in the voting? So it's not as simple as just voting, but that's kind of the general trend. And what is a republic? A country where people elect others to represent them. And that's where we live. Remember Montesquieu? He said that we should divide the powers of our government up into 3 separate but equal branches. And I kind of talk to everybody as if you know what those 3 branches are. I want to make sure you do. The legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. In the United States, we call the legislative branch Congress. And Congress in our country has 2 parts, the Senate and the House of Representatives. In our country, we call the executive branch the president, and his job is to enforce the laws. Congress makes the laws, the legislative branch makes the laws, the president enforces the laws. And of course, the judicial branch, in our country, we call it the Supreme Court, and their job is to review the laws, judicial review, okay? A group of people who makes laws in a country, that's what the legislative branch is. So the head of government, the chief of state, that's 2 different jobs. In our country, the president does both jobs. In Great Britain, the head of government is the queen or the king. Right now, it's the queen. And the chief of state is the king or the queen, and the head of government is the prime minister. Sorry, I just twisted that around right there because I was getting so excited to talk about the king or queen. So again, let's just use Great Britain as an example. The legislative branch in Great Britain makes the laws, but they call theirs Parliament. And Parliament has the House of Lords and the House of Commons, right? So that's the legislative branch. The executive branch in Great Britain would be 2 parts, okay? The chief of state would be the king or queen, right now the queen, and the head of government would be the prime minister, the person who actually runs government, does what they're supposed to. From feudalism to democracy, the Magna Carta paves the way. This whole process of people controlling their government and political development can be traced all the way back to medieval times. In 1215, the king fought a war against Parliament, and Parliament forced him to sign the Magna Carta, saying that he couldn't raise taxes. Even the British were mad about taxes, not just American colonists. So couldn't raise taxes without Parliament approval, aka the lords and nobles had to approve if the king wanted to raise taxes. Okay, and so they established a parliament, right? A group of men to make laws and share power with the king. Now I say men, it was men back then. Today it's men and women. We've kind of transitioned, okay, not in 1215 per se. Flash forward to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and introducing a clear set of rules where Parliament is in control. Remember the English Civil War. Again, there's so many steps I could put in here. The English Civil War happens in the middle of the 1600s, so a couple hundred years after Parliament is formed. And again, Parliament beats the king and has Charles I's head chopped off, right? And then they invite William and Mary, of course, to come in that glorious revolution. William the Third, and then they create an English Bill of Rights, a document guaranteeing freedoms and giving power to Parliament. And of course, that kind of leads to the Declaration of Independence for us as Americans. But if you live in Great Britain today, I think it feels as free as it does here in the United States. It's a very open society, and they've had transitions along the way as well. But of course, as an American, we focus on the most important document, the Constitution. It has 7 articles. The first article talks about the legislative branch, Congress. The second article talks about the executive branch, the president. The third talks about the judicial branch, the Supreme Court. And then the fourth one talks about relations among states. The fifth article talks about how to amend or change the Constitution. It's possible, not easy. And then the sixth one says that the federal government has national supremacy. And the seventh one says everybody has to sign this so it turns into law. And then, of course, we added amendments later in the Bill of Rights, are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. This was written in 1787. It's an Enlightenment document. And I would go into more depth if I teach a government class for seniors, so I'd go way more into depth. But right now, just trying to connect the dots. I hope that's what I'm doing. The U.S. Constitution shows that our government, what it should look like and how it should work. And the Constitution is what governs our country. And of course, we added a Bill of Rights. At first, many states didn't want to sign the Constitution because it didn't preserve people's freedoms. And so the writers added 10 amendments or changes to the Constitution called the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is a list of our freedom and rights, and it was added just after the Constitution was formed. Today, there are 27 amendments. So in over 200 years, only 27 changes, and the first 10 were made in the first couple of years. Okay, why does government matter? Should there be anarchy? Why did we divide our government into 3 branches? It makes it complicated, and it means things don't get done quickly, but we don't want one person or one group of people to get too much control. And we need to balance that, and we need to understand how our government works so that our government doesn't take power from us, the people. If you don't know your rights, you'll lose them. If you don't know rights, no rights. And that's 2 different spellings of the word no, as in N-O rights, no rights. If you don't K-N-O-W, if you don't know your rights. Anyways, we set up a system of checks and balances, and some people don't like laws and they think it restricts people's freedoms. But if you have right to do whatever you want, that's fine until you meet somebody else. And if you want to do whatever you want and somebody else wants to do whatever they want, there comes a time where our rights overlap each other. Like if I want to blast my music as loud as I want, I should have that right to do it whenever I want. But my next door neighbor might also have the right to be able to go to bed at a decent time or to put his kids to bed at a decent time. So I shouldn't be able to play my music as loud as I want if he's going to put his kids to bed when he wants. Our rights overlap. And that, of course, is where we make laws and why we make laws. And so people have been asking questions about democracy and what it means. And if the people can vote, does that mean democracy? And if we were in class, I think we would take some time to hash some of these out. You know, what is an example of a republic in our modern world? I hope you know that we live in a republic in the United States. Where did we get these ideas of democracy and how much how much power should the people give to the government? And how do we take that power back from the government if it takes it? And if democracy is so great, why doesn't everybody in the world have it? And how has democracy changed over times? And what are the problems with democracy? And what are the options? What are the other forms of government that exist out there? From anarchy, no government, to complete totalitarian dictatorship, from communism to fascism to parliamentary to monarchy. What are the different processes? And again, there are different forms of democracy that come from the ancient Greeks and Romans who built the world's first republic, and how we applied those principles into our modern system of government today. And I spent a lot of time last week going over Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian and even British and French influence on the American system. Now, as always, there are some review videos that are great for you to go check out. Thank you for being here. Week 13, political development. And next week, we're going to talk about the French Revolution.